Bayer is one of the world's most recognized companies, with most people associating it with aspirin, right? And I would say that is highly appropriate, considering Bayer is essentially responsible for inventing it. The company itself dates back to 1860s Germany, when Friedrich Bayer teamed up with Johann Westcott to start a company to create pigments. By the end of that century, Bayer had already grown into a much larger and much more diversified company that now included a legendary pharmaceutical department. One of the chemists working there, named Felix Hoffmann, potentially alongside Alex Eichengrun, a fellow chemist, synthesized the compound for the first time. I guess that the active ingredient in it had been used as a painkiller for centuries, but this right here was the creation of aspirin as we know it. In fact, that word aspirin originated as a brand name that Bayer created to sell their product. They received patents for it in various countries around the world, including the United States, meaning in the early 1900s, Bayer was the only company legally allowed to sell it in the country, originally in powder form, but by 1915 they started selling those tablets with the famous Bayer cross stamped on top of them. However, oddly enough, the United States entered World War I just as Bayer's patent was expiring. In 1918, an agency owned by the US government took control of their trademark and sold it to a company called Sterling at a government auction with a bid of $5.3 million. And it took over 75 years for Bayer to reacquire the American rights to the product, meaning from 1918 to 1994, all Bayer aspirin sold in the United States was sold by a different company. I want to be clear up front that creating aspirin is only one of many scientific contributions that Bayer has been responsible for over the past 160 plus years. But there's also been growing negativity associated with Bayer, to a point where I would consider it one of the more hated companies out there at this point, making it a perfect subject for my series on the world's most hated companies. For this video, my goal is not to convince you to dislike Bayer by picking at or exaggerating every little thing that they have done wrong, but rather I would like to objectively inform you about 5 of the main reasons as to why Bayer has been received so poorly. I know that is a fine line, but I'm going to do my best here. Starting out with the size of the company, because many people have argued that Bayer has become too controlling within its industries. Look, even though they are mostly known for selling aspirin, that is only a small part of what they do. Bayer Group is made up of 291 consolidated companies in 80 countries that employ over 90,000 people. They are consistently ranked on Fortune's Global 500 list, meaning the equivalent of around $50 billion in sales makes them one of the largest companies in the world. Close to half of those sales come from what they label as crop science. They claim to be the world's leading agricultural enterprise when ranked by sales, dealing with things like seeds and herbicides, while the rest of their business comes from pharmaceuticals like prescription drugs and consumer health, as in over-the-counter drugs. Notably, in 1978, they acquired Miles Laboratories that gave them control of Alka-Seltzer as well as One-A-Day and Flintstones vitamins. And then in 2014, they made a $14 billion acquisition that gave them control of the drugs Claritin and Miralax, as well as the brands Coppertone and Dr. Scholl's that they ended up selling only 5 years later. I will admit that it is hard to put together a full picture here because Bayer has been a part of so many massive business deals, most of which are more behind the scenes, the type of stuff that likely would not be recognizable to the average consumer. What I'm trying to convey here is simply that Bayer is one of the largest, most powerful companies in each of these areas, and that can be seen as dangerous. My next reason behind the hatred is going to take us all the way back to the early 1900s again, but I think it is worth mentioning heroin, probably the only time that you will ever see it on a list on this channel. It is widely recognized as one of the most addictive drugs out there, and even though Bayer did not invent heroin, they are considered to be the company most responsible for popularizing it. In the early 1900s, believe it or not, Bayer was producing it on a commercial level as a safer alternative to morphine. At the time, chronic coughing from tuberculosis or pneumonia was a common problem, and Bayer was selling heroin as a way to suppress suppress that cough, in addition to being an effective painkiller. I mean, there was a time when heroin was a key component of their sales mix, which proved to be an issue. As the addictive properties of the drug became better understood, it became less recommended, so Bayer stopped producing it in 1913, and it has since been completely banned in the United States. Clearly, there are some factors that should be considered here, but it still sounds pretty wild when I say that Bayer has technically marketed heroin as a cough medicine. Moving on to the next reason on my list, which is another very heavy subject, the Holocaust. Yeah, in 1925, Bayer merged with 5 other chemical companies from Germany to form IG Farben that instantly became Germany's main chemical company. If you were to combine all the others within the country, this was still 3 times as big. IG Farben went on to form strong connections with Hitler and the Nazi Party. The History Channel went so far as to call IG Farben the conglomerate of German chemical industries that formed the financial heart of the Nazi regime. They were given control of chemical companies from other countries that had been taken over by the Nazis and heavily utilized forced labor during World War II. In 1940, it was estimated that forced labor made up 1/3 of their workforce. According to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, IG Farben paid a doctor a retainer to test drugs on unwilling prisoners in concentration camps that were often deliberately infected with the condition that they were trying to treat. I mean, this is a deep and depressing subject, and you might want to research it more to get a fuller understanding of it. What I want to express here is that Bayer is one of 6 companies that combined to form one of the most ethically questionable conglomerates of all time. Following the war, the Allied forces took control of IG Farben, split it up, and essentially made Bayer its own company once again. Going back to the list with yet another heavy subject, HIV. For this one, I am referring to a scandal in the 1980s where Bayer may have been responsible for infecting hundreds of people with the virus. I highly recommend reading this New York Times article from 2003 if you want a more technical and detailed understanding of the situation. But from my understanding, in the 1970s, there was this great advancement in medicine. People with hemophilia could now be treated with a factor concentrate that is made by pulling blood plasma from thousands of donors. But if some of those donors happen to have HIV, the hemophiliacs injecting the concentrate are at risk of contracting that virus, and you can probably see where this is going. In 1974, Bayer acquired Cutter Laboratories that went on to market these blood products in the 1980s that were contaminated. Once it was found out that the original products were putting people at risk, they made a new, safer version that was heat-treated to kill any HIV that might be present. Then, things get really sketchy because they started to sell the old, contaminated product in Asian and Latin American countries. I know I'm having trouble explaining this properly. It's a hard thing to summarize, but there were multiple legal settlements connected to this, where the company never admitted any wrongdoing. The overview here is that a division of Bayer allegedly sold a contaminated product that infected hundreds of people with HIV, and even after learning that it was contaminated, they allegedly continued selling that product in other countries, continuing to infect more individuals, likely because they had already invested a lot of money into it and they did not want to see it go to waste. My final reason behind the hatred of Bayer is going to be Monsanto. You may have seen this one coming because in 2018, Bayer finalized their deal to pay over $60 billion to acquire Monsanto. It was not only Bayer's biggest acquisition, it was the biggest one ever by a German company. Today, many people consider this to be one of the worst acquisitions of all time, partially because in the following years, the value of the combined company on the stock market steadily dropped below that $60 billion mark. The two companies together were worth less than they paid for the one company. Monsanto was a giant chemical company with a horrible reputation. In fact, this series of mine where I talk about the most hated companies was partially inspired by Monsanto, with it being the first subject of the series back on the first day of 2020. Some of the reasons behind the hatred that I mentioned in that video include their involvement with the atomic bomb during World War II and Agent Orange during Vietnam, but the most relevant reasons today are their involvement with GMOs and the highly controversial herbicide Roundup. As you may already know, because this has been highly publicized, there is an ingredient in Roundup that likely causes cancer. So now, as the new company behind the product, Bayer has been receiving all the criticism associated with it, and it has been a legal nightmare for them. Most significantly, there was a $10 billion settlement related to it in 2020, just a few months after I made that Monsanto video, so I'm sure you can tell why this is considered such a bad acquisition for Bayer. The deal fueled the criticism of them being too big, it connected them to a lot of existing controversy, and it placed them as the defendant in a lot of expensive, high-profile lawsuits. I want to conclude here by saying that for a company like Bayer, who has been dealing with inherently controversial businesses like drugs, chemicals, and seeds for as long as they have, you can almost expect a certain degree of criticism along with a certain degree of praise. For example, in 1939, a scientist from Bayer received the Nobel Prize for discovering an antibacterial drug. So, like most things in life, there are complexities here. It is not a black and white issue, but at the same time, when put together all at once like this, it can be troubling to see this list. Bayer is a large company that popularized heroin, had close connections to the Nazi Party, may have knowingly infected people with HIV, and was involved with one of the most criticized mergers of all time. Let me know in the comments, what are your thoughts about Bayer? Do they deserve all of this hatred, or do you think some of it has been exaggerated? Or is there something I failed to mention that you think deserves more attention? What are your personal biggest reasons for disliking this company? And I'm also curious to hear about any other companies you recommend I cover in this series. I'm talking about companies that are pretty universally disliked, the ones that receive an abnormal amount of hatred and criticism for a variety of reasons. And any other thoughts you have about Bayer, leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching.